Yemen has been in turmoil since the popular uprising in 2011 that ousted President Ali Abdullah Saleh after a 33-year reign. Demonstrators rallied for democratic and economic reforms, yet critical shortages persist for simple staples such as water and bread. The United Nations has said nearly half of Yemen's population is growing hungry. The impoverished country is also the main staging area for terrorist attacks against the West. The United States, along with the Yemen government, has been waging an offensive against a growing insurgency from al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Yemen's military has also been fighting a tribal war in the north against the Shiite Houthi fighters and defending itself against armed secessionists in the south. Joining us now to discuss the plight of Yemen is Rafat Al-Akhali. Mr. Akhali is a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council and the co-founder and chairman of Resonate Yemen, a non-profit foundation engaging youth in public policy. Rafat, thanks for joining us. We just heard a whole catalogue of problems there that Yemen is facing. There was also violence at the beginning of this month, 120 people killed in fighting between Houthi rebels and government forces. What is the security situation like in the country right now?
Thank you, Alan. As you mentioned, the situation is really difficult right now. We're going through a very critical moment in Yemen's history, and I think a lot of people expected that it wouldn't be an easy ride, this whole transitional period, because of the situation even before 2011. So right now, there's a lot of conflict happening, a lot of violence, as you mentioned, a bit in the north. Also in the south with the secessionist movement, but the main topic of discussion in the past few months, at least, is really the economic crisis, not the security crisis.
Now, that economic crisis that you're talking about, how is the government dealing with shortages of staples, like we said, shortages of bread, shortages of water? There's been electricity cuts, there's been gas shortages.
Absolutely. Yeah, that has been the real challenge, especially for people living in urban centers such as the capital, Sana'a, where we've had really huge lineups for fuel. We've had extended power outages, almost 16 to 18 hours a day of outages. And the real reason is the fiscal crisis that the government is facing. The huge shortage of revenues, especially with the attacks on the oil pipelines, has caused a big budget deficit that the government is no longer able to pay for the subsidies, for the fuel subsidies, and provide the necessary services that people are looking for. Now, the government has been working on a reform program, and it has been announced last month that they would go ahead and start implementing these reforms. And they've also been in discussions with the IMF to work a support program as well. And so we hope to see at least some relief that would get us through this year and cover the budget deficit.
Okay, you talk about reforms. Could you give us some idea of what reforms they're looking at?
Well, the two major reforms that the government is talking about is civil service reform, because we have hundreds of thousands of people on the public payroll, but we really don't know if they exist or not. So we face a huge issue of what we call double dippers and ghost workers, both in the military and security forces and within the civil service itself. And so one of the major reforms are implementing biometric fingerprint system to try and eliminate double dippers and ghost workers. The other major reform is fuel subsidy reforms, because the government has continued to subsidize fuel, mostly gasoline and diesel, and is no longer able to do that. So it's not sustainable anymore. And they are now in a position where they absolutely have to do something with subsidy reforms. So these are the two major reforms now.
Getting back to the security situation, how is the government responding to these attacks? Yemen is facing a security threat on three fronts. You've got the Houthi rebels, you've got a secessionist movement in the south, and you've got al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula all over the country.
Yeah, for the secessionist movement in the south, there hasn't really been huge attacks or acts of violence. And the political process has taken control over the issue of the Southern Secessionist movement. The president has been working very closely with a lot of the secessionist movement leaders and having regular meetings with them. And so it has been a quiet front, at least in the past few months. Now AQAP, or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, has been the main challenge. And as you know, I mean, AQAP is more of a threat to Yemenis than to the West. They have killed more Yemenis over the past few years than any attacks against Western or foreign interests. And so the government has launched an offensive in April, and in Shabwa, in Abyan, in the main fronts where AQAP is present. And that continues to be. Now, this morning, unfortunately, we've heard about an attack by AQAP in Sayoun, in Hadramaut, which is in the east, on the airport and on the telecom corporation. But the anti-terrorism forces have announced that they control the situation now. So it is not. It is mostly small pockets of AQAP that tries to launch these offensive every now and then and attacks both on civilians and on military forces in Yemen. The Houthi issue is a more complicated issue because it is not a clear-cut insurgency or rebel movement anymore, but rather a mix of tribal issues, political issues between them and other political parties. And the army so far, at least this week, has announced that they are not officially a side in these conflicts, and they are trying to control it as much as they can.
Does the government have control over the entire country?
I wouldn't say that they have control over the entire country, but in Yemen it's a very interesting situation since even pre-2011, where the government always relied on a mix of official presence as well as cultural, or let's say the tribal system that is in place that really made sure that it balances any void left by lack of government services. So that has always been the case, where in a lot of areas, especially rural areas, there's more presence of the tribal system that is semi-linked to the government, and in urban areas there's more presence of government and the security forces.
So, as you pointed out at the outset of the interview, Yemen is going through a transition right now. So 2.5 years after President Saleh stepped down, and when you look at daily life for Yemenis in the country, has life got better or worse for them in the past 2.5 years?
I would say it got worse, especially when it comes to basic services, as I mentioned, because if we look at the economic situation, it has deteriorated, again, because of the security gap, because of the new scene, sort of a political scene that now has not only a dominant party or family or president, but rather a balance of powers across multiple entities. And so naturally there's a lot of conflict between these entities, which led to this huge deterioration in basic life and basic services. And so when it comes to the economic side of things, it is certainly more challenging now than before. But we are still hopeful, because at least we see on the political side that things are progressing according to plan, not according to the timeline necessarily, but at least the steps are being followed. We are now drafting the new constitution. We are really looking forward to get to a point where we have decentralization on the ground and move away from the power centers in the capital, and start giving local people the ability to control their future and have more say in how they run their daily lives.
Rafat, what about outside help? Is Yemen getting the help that it needs? It was promised something like $8 billion at a pledging conference. Very little of that has materialized. Is that going to change?
Well, as you said, there was 7.9 billion pledged in September 2012, both in Riyadh and New York donor conferences. And so far, what has been disbursed is about 35% of that. Now, the remaining amounts, what was quickly dispersed is any humanitarian assistance, any support for the peaceful transition, governance issues. What the government is currently facing challenges in is absorbing the funds that have been allocated to infrastructure projects. Because when you start looking at these mega projects in power, in roads, you really need a very capable project implementation units and procedures that allow the quick absorption of this. So that's where the challenge right now is. There's still about at least 5 billion that is not dispersed. The government has been working very actively with the donors to try and get that much dispersed. The concern in the past few months has been to try and allocate or get more funds to the budget directly. So direct budget support is what Yemen is looking for right now to get through this financial crisis.
Okay, so Rafat Al-Akali, thanks for joining us.